All right, today is Monday, November 9th. This is going to be the last lecture from the book. So as always, if you'd please go out to the P drive for the class, there is a folder out there with today's date on it. And if you'd copy that folder to your virtual desktop, I'll give you a second to do that. Yes. And I'll do the same. Now we're going to go over chapters 19 and 20. Chapter 19 is literally 5 pages long, so it'll take about 5 to 10 minutes to go through. If you notice, just so you know, there's a bunch of stuff I added out here also. All right, and what I mean is there are some articles and stuff that I found online. This is all stuff that's discussed in chapters 19 and 20. So I'm not going to go through any of that stuff, but just so you see, there is another folder underneath your folder that's called articles, and that folder has got a bunch of stuff in it. All right, chapter 19 has got a couple small files, and chapter 20 has got some more stuff, and we'll talk about that when we get in there in just a couple minutes. Okay. All right, so chapter 19, which starts on page 327, as the author says, there are 2 objectives here. Understand the architecture of a JavaScript-based web app and understand the basics of Ajax. All right, a lot of next semester, a lot of the 152, 167 class will be on Ajax, and it will be Ajax related. All right. So the author says that one of the things we haven't been doing a lot of in this book so far has been using JavaScript and using it kind of in conjunction to build a complete website. And that's what he gets into in these two chapters rather. Now, if you look up on the screen here, I'm not going to read any of this to you, but if you look at the paragraph that's up there, the idea today is what users want, all right, is they want web applications that act and react like a desktop application. In other words, as far as they're concerned, they don't even want to know that they're on the web. And when you say, what do you mean like a desktop application? Like anything you'd open up on your desktop, like Access, like Excel, or something like that. It's the idea is there shouldn't be any difference, all right, in the way things work. Now, it could look different, but it should pretty much work the same way. And then the author gets in and says, in order to do that, there's 3 basic components here that we have to talk about. You can see them on the bottom of page 327. The first is display. And as it says, it's the look and feel of the page. If you have not heard of the term yet, UX, which stands for user experience, it's something you should really look up. It's something that as time goes by, we're going to have to add to this program. And part of it is, and I'm just going to give it to you in a nutshell, this is my understanding of it. So if you go out and look online, they might have a definition that's totally different than the one I'm about to give you. But the fact is that if I create a website today that's going to promote some product, whatever the product is, there's a pretty good chance that there are a lot of other websites out there that are going to do the same thing. Unless I have my own product that's unbelievably unique. But when you think about it, if I wanted to go out there and buy a piece of sporting equipment, all right, a fishing rod or something like that, that I could go out there and I could probably go to at least 10 different sites, find the same thing. So what's going to differentiate, me going from one to the other? Well, one will be the price. I mean, that makes sense. All right, I might even go and search first to see whether, but let's say that I can go out to 10 sites and they all have the fishing rod at the same price. Well, then probably what I'm going to be looking for is when I go out to a page is which website makes me feel the most comfortable. How easy is it for me to put something in a shopping cart, to show me information about a project or a product rather, etc. That's the user experience. All right, because the web has gotten to a sophisticated enough point right now that websites have got to do something to distinguish themselves from one another. And that's part of what I consider to be the user experience. The second is the behavior. Well, if I click a button that says add this to cart, it sure as heck better add it to the cart. I might try it 2 or 3 times, but if I click a button to add a fishing rod to a cart and nothing happens and I try it 3 or 4 times, I'm probably going to leave. Because again, I can probably go to a dozen other sites and do the same thing. All right. And the last, as it says, is the server component. And that's what we get into in the second year of the program. But I'm actually going to show you something regarding that in when we get into Chapter 20. It's not going to mean a whole heck of a lot to you. But again, the idea is if I'm sitting there at my machine and I'm putting something into a shopping cart and I click a button that says checkout, as an example. And you've all either seen things like that or maybe done things like that or both. All right. The idea is once I click that button that says checkout, I'm not going to be on the browser anymore. It's got to have to go out to a server someplace because it's got to look and see, okay, I want to order this fishing rod. Do I have any in stock? Type of an idea. All right. So the idea when they say the server component, I'm sitting at my browser doing something, but when I get to a certain point, I'm going to be sending a message out, and that message is going to be sent out to a server someplace. And we talked about this much, much earlier in the semester, so you may or may not remember it. But when you're on the browser side, so if I'm sitting on the browser, even if it's something as simple as I go to the browser and I type in blackhawk.edu and hit enter. Well, what's happening there? I'm creating a hypertext transfer protocol request. It's being sent someplace over the internet, and ideally it's being found at one or more of the Blackhawk Technical College servers. And what that server that responds to my request is supposed to do is it's supposed to send me back an HTTP or a hypertext transfer protocol response that says, here's your web page. And it shows it to me in HTML format. And if you go, yeah, well, I get that. That's a lot of what this stuff here is about. All right. So they talk about it. They say display the page layout. And, once you get into it, well, what does distinguish one page from the other? A lot of times, again, it's the look and feel. So it's things like how things are laid out on the screen. What kind of CSS is used? How good is the CSS? What's the color scheme like, etc. All right. Behavior. All right, I put a little note in here for myself. It says if I'm running a script or let's say I've got a form, I click the submit button and nothing appears to happen, okay? What am I probably going to do after a few seconds? I'm going to click it again. So typically, if I send something and there's going to be some kind of a time lapse, then what I want to do is I want to take that form submit button and gray it out, make it inactive or disabled, just so that the person doesn't try to do it again. Because, as you just said, if it doesn't work, I'm going to click it again. And guess what? If it doesn't work in a few more seconds, I'm going to do it again. It's like it never ceases to amaze me here that people send something to the printer and it doesn't work. So what do? They send it again. And it still doesn't work. So they send it again. Sometimes I'll see the same job in there 8 times. All right. Other things. When an input field gains focus, should it change color? All right. Sometimes if you're on a field and you don't fill it out correctly, what you put in there will turn red or the background will turn red to show you that there's a problem. And sometimes at sites too, when you put in something correct and you move from field to field, the background might turn a light green just to show you, yeah, everything you're doing is okay. All right, those are just little visual hints that can be added to make the user's experience easier. All right, so it says here, JavaScript, at least as far as this book is concerned, doesn't interact directly with a database or a server. All right, but one of the ways that JavaScript can be used as kind of a conduit between the client and the server is to use this thing called Ajax that we're going to look at in just a bit. All right. And they go through their example. Of course, he's pushing a Microsoft product here, and he talks about Bing Maps. And there's nothing at all wrong with Bing Maps, but I want to show you, to me, this is a real simple way of looking at this stuff. So if I go out to familyvideo.com, all right, and I click on new release rentals right here, and I take my mouse and I put it over inside out right there. Is that pretty obvious what's happening when I do that? That's a fairly new concept. That's Ajax in action, because what it's doing is it's, when I highlight that, it's refreshing part of the page, the part that it needs to add that information. And as soon as I move off, it goes away. When I move on to another one, I get that one. The way it used to work years ago was every time I would do something like this, you'd get what would be called a flicker. The page would have to redraw itself and show that information. That was kind of a pain to people. You'd notice the flicker, and it'd take a little time to do that because the screen would have to redraw itself. You don't have to do that anymore. All right. If you've ever gone on to Google Maps and you've zoomed in or zoomed out on something when you were looking at it, the same kind of thing is happening right there. All right. And that's what the author is talking about in here. So the magic, again, so to speak, that makes that happen is Ajax. The kind of interesting thing about this, well, first of all, Ajax, it's an acronym. Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. That's what it stands for. It's actually not a new concept. It's about 20 years old. But it's new as far as how it's being used, how it's been used in the last few years. The guy who wrote a paper on this, on Ajax, and coined the term is a gentleman named Jesse James Garrett. All right, and again, that article that he wrote is about 20 years old. The article is in the articles folder that I put out there for you. All right, and there's some stuff in there at the end. They do an interview with him, etc. And the real interesting thing about this is Ajax, not knowingly, but Ajax is actually a Microsoft idea, brainchild, whatever you want to say. But what Microsoft did was they created something that wasn't used like Ajax, but they had this XML request, HTTP request object that they talk about right here that wasn't being used for that. And then people got the idea, hey, we've got this thing, we could use it to do this. All right? But the cornerstone, so to speak, of it was from Microsoft. All right. In order for this stuff to work, what they're saying is there has to be some kind of a conversation that takes place between a client and a server. The reason that that's important to you is virtually 100% of the stuff we've done this semester has been client-side only. You have not sent anything out to a server. You have not done that. All right? We do that, and again, I don't know how Denny's going to teach the class next semester, but you might do that in the 152, 147 relational database development class. You might not. I don't know. All right? But one of the things that you end up doing, and I just wanted to show you what this looks like. You don't have to bring it up. You don't have to do this. But when you get here, I'm on the virtual desktop right now. And what you all have available to you on the virtual desktop, even if you don't see that on your screen, which you may or may not see on your screen, all right? But you all could do this. You could go to Programs, go down near the bottom, and you'd find something that's called XAMPP. Some books call it XAMPP. But the point is, what that is it's software that allows you to use this computer right in front of you as both a client and as a server, all right? Which is something we don't do until the second year of the program. All right, why is that an important thing? Because what you can do is you can simulate sending stuff out to an actual website and getting information back. That's one of the reasons that you use XAMPP. All right. But as they mentioned, a central concept here is there has to be some server-side interaction. Otherwise, it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Now, they mentioned in the chapter in a couple places in here that there's some good Microsoft tutorials and some good Microsoft articles, etc. Most of those I put in here. So they're in that articles folder, just so you know that they're there. All right. But what the author says is if you're using a server-side application, you're going to want to use something like ASP.NET or PHP or Java server pages or something else. Again, we don't do that this semester. We don't do that in much depth, at least next semester. But the second year of the program, that's what we concentrate on. There is a PHP class that you take. There is an ASP.NET class that you take. All right? All right. When you do this and you work with Ajax, you've kind of got your choice. You can write Ajax and you can write it strictly using regular JavaScript, or you can write it with a minimal amount of regular JavaScript and with jQuery. Again, the advantage of writing it and using jQuery is typically you end up writing less code. The code, at least at first, may seem a little bit more complex, but that's because it's got a bunch of stuff packed into it. And what the jQuery is doing is it's calling all those other JavaScript things in the background where you don't have to worry about them. All right. Finally, they mention here on page 330, it says Ajax without the X. As I mentioned to you, for years, Ajax was known as asynchronous JavaScript and XML. The problem with XML, which stands for the Extensible Markup Language, is it's verbose, which means it's wordy. The difference between XML and HTML is with XML, you make your own tags. Now think about that. You may think, wow, cool. All right. But it's really important that, let's suppose, for example, that I work at Lowe's. Okay? And I'm going to order in a bunch of furniture. And Roger works for that furniture company. Okay? Well, we can agree that we're going to have information that we exchange back and forth, but we could make our own, for example, our own tag that was called table. Okay? And that's fine. But what if I want to write an HTML table in there? That's called table too. So we have to find a way to converse with one another where whatever tags we're using, we agree upon what their meaning is. There are somewhere between 200 and 500 different variations of XML up there. There's even one, for example, called chess SML or XML, where you can play chess using XML. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you could do it if you wanted to. There's music XML. There's chemical XML. All right, so there's a lot of different XMLs. So again, as I mentioned, it's verbose. As it says, it means that there's a good amount of information exchanged, which may not be a bad thing unless you've got a lot of information that you're exchanging. So they show you here on 331, and this isn't a great example because it doesn't show a lot. But if you look up on the screen right here, this is XML. So notice you've got a person, beginning and end tag. Each person has a first name. Each has a last name. Each has an email address. Each has a Twitter handle. All right? And again, for each one of those, and there are tools that will write XML for you, but this gets really big, really ugly, real fast. Plus, it really doesn't look very much like JavaScript. All right? So what has become much more in vogue lately is to use what's called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And that's it right here. We haven't gotten into it all, how you write object-oriented JavaScript. But when you do, it looks very similar to that. That's why people kind of like this. The code is easier to read, typically. You may or may not agree with that, but that's kind of the consensus that it's easier to use. The reason I'm telling you that is, even though the term is still called Ajax, most people will tell you today that Ajax doesn't stand for anything, because more and more people are using JSON to work with their with their JavaScript than they are using XML. All right, and literally that was it for that chapter. So I'm just going to jump right ahead and go into chapter 20. Again, this is the last chapter in the book that I'm going to cover. This is a heavy chapter. So if the stuff in here doesn't make a lot of sense, don't let it worry you in the least, because they talk about status codes and return codes and a bunch of other stuff. Some of it you may have heard before, some of it may be totally new to you. You'll hear some about it next semester, but again, the goal of this is to introduce this to you. It's not to confuse you to the point where you go, I'm never going to get this stuff. All right. So we want to learn how to create an Ajax request, retrieve data from a server using Ajax, and use the jQuery Ajax function to retrieve data from a server. I already mentioned this to you. that this is the object that you use in order to be able to work with, all right, in order to be able to work with Ajax, all right? Now, as it says, this object was first available in Internet Explorer 5.0, so it's been around a while. And what they mention in here is if you're using a version earlier than IE7, the way that you have to create an object like this, it's a little bit different. If you're IE7 and later, you can just do this. It's not really hard, all right? So this is saying I want to create a new variable called REQ for request, and what's it going to be? A brand new XML HTTP request. So if I go down to the next page, again, like I said, if this doesn't totally make sense to you right now, don't let it bother you, please. All right? Because what they're showing in there is error handling. And they're showing error handling to you in what's known as a try-catch type of block. And again, if you've never seen that before, I wouldn't expect it to make a lot of sense. In English, what it says is, all right, what I want to do here is I want to try to return a brand new HTTP request object. But guess what? It might fail. And it might fail because maybe I've got a really old browser or whatever. So what this says is try to do this. If this doesn't work, come down here and then try to do it again this way. And if that doesn't work, then come through there and try doing it that way. And if that doesn't work, you're kind of hosed. All right? So when you've got a try-catch block like this, the try means try to do something. But it's something that could possibly fail. So the catch says, okay, then there was, if this didn't work, it's going to come down here automatically. If this works right away, you skip all this stuff and you just go down to right there. But if this doesn't work, you go down to here and you do this. If this works, you skip all this stuff and you go down to the bottom. But if you try this and it doesn't work, and you try this and it doesn't work, then you try this one. And if it works, you skip that catch and you go down to the bottom. But if you try this and it doesn't work, and you try this and it doesn't work, and you try that and it doesn't work, that means your browser doesn't support Ajax. That's what it means. All right? So when you've got a try block, you put code in there that could possibly fail. And the catch says, okay, if it fails for this reason, try to do this. They don't even show it there, but there's actually something else you could put on the bottom that's called a finally block. I'm not even going to go through it. You get introduced to this stuff, introduced to it, next semester in the regular Java class. But we don't use it in a lot of depth and breadth until the advanced Java class. Then you learn how to write your own things to put in here. And for instance, this year I had the class work on it was a bank account example. And what you had to do was if the balance in your account fell below $25, you couldn't take out any money. So you had to check for something like that. So you check for that in the try block. And if you were trying to do a withdrawal and you had less than had $25 or less in there, you couldn't do the withdrawal. That was the kind of an idea. And they wrote their own exception handlers to do that. And it really isn't very difficult. The exception handlers themselves are about 5 or 6 lines long. All right. All right, so he talks, if that confused you, on the bottom of 336 and the top of 337, he goes into talking about try-catch. Maybe you'd like his verbiage better than mine. I don't know. All right. So let's suppose that we were able to create one of these XML HTTP request objects. So the author says, now that you've got this object in hand, you can send requests to the web server and get responses. To send the request, you use a combination of open and send for this. And they mention that there's 2 ways of doing this. And I just want to go through these, not spend a lot of time on them, but spend a little bit of time on them, all right? Going through and talking about, hopefully at least, what's going on in there. And the first thing that you've got to be aware of is the A in Ajax stands for asynchronous, all right? Now, when people get confused with synchronous versus asynchronous, human conversation, if Roger and I are having a conversation, ideally, it's synchronous. In other words, I sit there and say a bunch of stuff. He sits and listens. Then when I get done, I stop talking. Then he starts talking. And ideally, I'm the same way towards him. I stop and I start listening and I wait until he's done. All right? But the idea is we can't be talking at the same time. All right? That's more or less a synchronous type of an operation. Okay? And when you're talking about it in computer terms, that might say, I asked the computer to do something. And now I can't do anything until the computer does it and gives me a response back that it's done it. Well, that's not the way most computers work. I mean, imagine that you did that. Let's say that I went down here to the bottom and I wanted to check the time. Now everything else has got to stop. When I click this, everything else has got to stop, all right, so that the time can come up on the screen. That'd be kind of silly, and that wouldn't, it wouldn't work very well, etc. So most of the stuff that's done with a computer is done asynchronously. In other words, it's able to do different things and keep going. All right, so what does that have to do with anything? Well, what I mentioned to you before when I showed you that family video, and I said that was an example of Ajax, that was something happening asynchronously. If the system had to stop when I put my mouse over that Inside Out movie, it literally had to stop, gather that information, and sit there and grab all that movie description information, then send it out, that would be being done synchronously. All right? And where it's important in here, and what you'll see is, well, what's the difference when I'm doing all this stuff? It's using the word true or the word false. That's the big thing. And you're going to see it in just a second. All right? So the author mentions when you send stuff in a synchronous manner, the requester waits for a response. It's done in what's called blocking. It just stops. All right. I used to make the joke, and then some people got very turned off by it or offended by it. I said it's kind of like human conversation is supposed to be synchronous, but if you've got a significant other, it's probably asynchronous. You start talking, and your significant other, no, it's not. And you're back and forth. All right. So they say before you can send a request, you have to build it. It says to do that, you use the open method. And it has 3 arguments. The 2 we're most concerned with right now are get and post. All right. I don't know in your Access class if you've looked at the Sql View in Access. My guess is that you have, and I see some head shaking. But you remember, if you do something like this, select star from employees, as an example. If I were to write a query like that, that's going to grab me all of the information in the employees table. That should make sense to everybody. But with that query, I can't change anything. Okay? It's just supplying me with information. That's a get. On the other hand, if I'm inserting information into a table, or if I'm updating information that's in a table, or if I'm deleting information that's in a table, those are a post. Okay? That's the basic difference between using a get and using a post. Now, when you use a get, what happens is the information appears in here. It appears in the address string. So let's see if I click here. Notice that? All the stuff here that I've highlighted in blue, that's called a query string. And what it's done is it says, okay, the ID for that product is 454335. So that's the ID for this. All right, and its category or resource is new release. And again, I can tell that's being sent through a get because I see that information up there. When you send information using a post, think about this. What if I was entering information into a table, and whether I was entering it or modifying it, let's say, and let's say that I asked somebody for their social security number. I don't want that to show in there. So when you use a post, rather than having the information show up here in what's called the query string, it gets hidden. All in what's called basically a post header. You can still dig out that information, but it takes more time and effort to do so. So if you take a look in here, I'm on the top of page 338. You look at this line, or these two lines that are in blue, and you look at these two lines that are in blue. All right? And whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, the only difference is asynchronous says true and synchronous says false. That's the only difference. All right? And then you just tell it you want it to be sent, and you do it like this. Now they do mention in here, and this is stuff you're going to have to at least look at, and I don't mean right this minute, but eventually you're going to have to get familiar with stuff like this. And what I mean is, if you look in here, let's see, of course I had to choose vacation. I want to choose something there. I want something that's going to give me more information than what these are giving me. I'm not going to find it anyway. All right. What you find out is, for example, here. See that ampersand? That's showing me that I'm done with the product ID and I'm about to start with the source. All right. So what I'm telling you is if I have something in here, I thought they gave the name of the different movies, but they're not. So for instance, if they did, and I wanted in here, for example, Magic Mike XXL, there would have to be a character there and another character there and another character there up in the query string here. It's not just a blank space. All right? There are different kinds of characters that get put in, and they talk about it right here. Spaces, etc. You use %sign with a number. You'll see it more, all right, later. It's not that big a thing right now, but at least that you've heard it is kind of a big thing. All right? What I like about what the author does here on the bottom of 338 and going to the top of 339 is he attempts to explain the HTTP request and HTTP response. Basically says that's how the web works, and he shows it all in here and here. Now, you're probably not going to read that where it's going to make total sense. Well, I'm an expert on this now. But at least, again, it's something that's out there that you can look at to start understanding it. All right? So, we've sent our HTTP request out, okay? Now we want to be able to process the response. And they're talking about it here. And the author mentions here on the bottom of page 339. Again, this may not look like anything much to you, but it's really, really important. If you look at what's in blue, they're up near the top of the screen. Because what they're saying here is, what we want to do is we want to call this website. We want to go to this website, Braingia or whatever it's called, .org. All right? And we want to bring up the add to page. But what we want to pass into that page, let's cancel that. What we want to pass into this page are num1 and num2. Num1 has got a value of 2, and num2 has got a value of 56. This might be like a really, really simple calculator. And when we call that, it should come back and return 58. All right? But what they're showing you right on the screen right here, in this area that's right there, is these are called key value pairs. The key is num1, the value is 2. The key is num2, the value is 56. So what they're showing, those are parameters, that's stuff that's getting passed into that website so that it's able to do whatever it is you're telling it to do. All right? So imagine that we had on screen a little hyperlink. And that hyperlink came up and there were two text boxes next to it. And it said, put a number in each one of the text boxes and click this hyperlink and I'll add the two numbers for you and show you the result. Does that make sense? That's pretty much what's happening right there. So you can imagine in the first text box we put a 2 in, And in the second text box, we put in a 56. All right, and that's kind of what the author is trying to show you here as far as what's happening. And again, you'll notice that they're passing it in as false. Now, when you do this stuff, and you start going back on the other side, we have to see whether or not basically the system is ready to handle it. So it says when you're working with asynchronous responses, it's more complex. Why is it more complex? Because imagine that what I'm able to do, let's say in that example right there, that calculator example, okay? That I can put in a 2 in one text box and a 56 in another text box, hit enter, click on the hyperlink, whatever. Now I'm able to go on and do other stuff. What if for some reason that site is really, really busy and it hangs there? The problem that you get when you're working with things asynchronously is if you're working with different servers and the like, sometimes there's a delay. It takes a while after you ask a question or you want something until you get an answer back. All right? So as it says, it's more unpredictable. All right, when the script will be notified that the response has been received. So when you look at this, what we care about as developers, out of all that stuff that's in there, what we care about is just the last one. All right, if we ask the system something and it returns a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or a 3, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But for lack of better words, it's like we're in a wait state. All right, we can't really go on until what we get returned is a 4. All right, because that means that it's been loaded. That means we've received all of it. And you look and you go, oh, wait a minute. What if it was a 3? It says we're receiving it. But what if we received it and there was a problem in transmission where part of it got through and then it just choked? All right, and it hung. All right. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that it's loaded and the response has been fully received. So before we send any information back, we want to make sure we've got all the information we need. And that's what the author is talking about in there. So when you look at this, and again, it looks a little bit complex because you've got a couple different things in there. You've got a thing called ready state and you've got a thing called status. And my guess is at some time or other, everybody in this room, you've been out to a website where there's a hyperlink on it someplace and you clicked on it and it comes back up and it says 404 error, file not found. You've had something along those lines happen. All right. That 404 was one of these statuses. Typically when you are calling this stuff and you get a status back that's not in the 200 level, something is wrong. The system could be hung. The server could be down. There could be all sorts of problems. But usually if you get a response level back in the 200s, you're fine. The 400s, I already mentioned to you. File not found. There could be other things. There could be problems with the server. There could be a lot of other different things. But you can look up these statuses and get a whole chart. All right. So in the next example, what the author tries doing in here is he tries sending one of these request objects to request a book and receive the title based on its ISBN. Well, I put this in right before the class started and didn't realize you had to go in and make changes to the code. All right, so it doesn't work, and that's on me. But one of the things that they talk about in here regarding this is something that's called same origin policy. And what they're saying is, if a server wants to talk to something along the way, it's got to make sure, as it says, that the server, the request that you're asking for is within the same domain as the calling script that was loaded. And you're like, what? What that means is, if it's expecting HTTP and all of a sudden it goes to HTTPS, it might not work. If it's coming through on a certain network port, and if you don't know what a port is, basically it's where it's coming through on the system. If I try to send it another request on another port, it might fail. So there's a lot of ways that you can make this stuff fail. All right. just so you see it. And I actually wrote something right before class. I was lucky that it worked. But that language right there that you look at, and you might say, well, that sort of makes sense. Maybe that get line doesn't, but the rest of the stuff sort of looks like stuff we've done before. That's PHP right there. That's a server-side language. All right? And what I did, and again, nothing big, nothing grand, nothing glorious, or anything like that. But I set something up where, actually I did it over here, not even on the virtual desktop. I did something over here where is it? I created this. It doesn't look like much. I put one line of CSS in there just so that stuff would line up. All right? So I come in here and I put in, okay, I've pre-filled it already. That's why the stuff is in there. And the idea is when I click submit, all right, it's like, well, what the heck is that doing? All right, it's not doing anything. All right, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to show me a PHP file, but I'm not running it under a program that allows me to use a PHP file. All right, and if you say, I still don't get it, I'm going to go back to the virtual desktop. Maybe I was on there, but I'm going back to the virtual desktop here, and I'm going to do the same thing. There it is. Okay, so there's all that information. I'm just going to fill it in again. So it's all filled in. Now when I click submit, notice what happens. Now it's not anything that big, but notice I was on an HTML file and it told me to bring up a PHP file. So what it did was it went over, and again, it's using this machine as both a client and a server. But it allowed me to utilize a server-side programming language to handle this. And again, that might not sound like it's very much. It's a pretty big thing. So it's done this for me. You look at that, well, that looks kind of weird. That's the HTML that was actually generated. I put the BR tags in there, okay? So it would look like this, because the first time I did it, everything was on the same line, because I forgot to put in BR tags. So that's what he goes through in here, okay? And then he turns around and says, well, you know what, again, most people don't like using this. They like using JSON. And again, typically the reason that they like using JSON is it's easier to work with, all right? It's not as ugly as XML is, etc. So he's got another example in here, and I don't know why he did it like this, but he did. And he said, well, what if we come in here and we have this list of states? I'm just jumping ahead a little bit. All right, so the author says, what if we have a list of a bunch of states? Okay. That's how you'd write it in JSON. But that looks kind of ugly. So what if we took that list of states and we ran it through a program and it printed out like this? That would make a lot more sense. He didn't do any work with this. As far as what we could have done is we could have sorted this in alphabetic order or by region of the country or whatever. But he's got a simple program in here that just takes this, and by just running it through a simple function, prints it out like this. And what he's trying to show you in here, I believe at least, is the fact that when you're working with Ajax, it's the idea of having a client send out HTTP requests, one or more requests, having those requests be answered by a server in terms of an HTTP response. And that HTTP response, remember, the only thing that the browser can understand is HTML. So I'm sitting there and I'm at my computer. So here's my computer, and I send something up. I type it in a URL or whatever. That's got to go out there someplace. So this is a client. This has got to go out to a server someplace. And that server might do a lot of other stuff with it. That server may end up sending it to another server, which may end up sending it to another server, which may end up sending it back to the original server. All right? So that can send back information to the client. As somebody on a browser, that I don't care. That's all hidden from me. All I care about is when I ask for Blackhawk's page, I want it to come up on my screen, or whatever it is I'm asking for. But in the background, so to speak, that's what's happening. And that's what the author explains throughout the chapter. All right? And then finally what he gets into at the end is he said, if that seems like too much work, all right, you can do all this stuff through jQuery, which is going to result in less code. Again, it might look a little more complex when you start it with it, but it's really less code. So what I put out here in these articles, if you care, this thing, A Technical Introduction to XML. It's an old article. I don't typically put stuff out there that's that old. This article is literally 20 years old. It was written in 1995. It's about 20 pages or so, but it explains what XML is. So if you want to know that, you can. Here's another one. An introduction rather, well, now that finally came up. So that's the introduction to XML. There's another one in here that's an introduction to JavaScript object notation, and it was from here, but it didn't print out very well. If you want more stuff on the actual jQuery Ajax function documentation, I took that right from the jQuery page and put it all out there. So there's a bunch of information if you want to see more than actually, typically what the author talks about in the chapter. All right? And that's all that I have. Now, I did go through, just so you know, yesterday, because again, not to be funny, but it's not like there was a football game on or anything. So I did go through yesterday, and unless you sent me something after 8 o'clock last night, all of your JavaScript has been graded. Now, with a couple of you, you've written me emails, etc., and you said you couldn't read this for some reason, but it comes up fine on my screen. If that happens, then show me. Just say, hey, if Roger says, Jeff, you said you couldn't grade this one, and it comes up fine on my, then just have me walk over there, and I'll grade from there. I don't care. All right? But at least with some of them, they look to be incomplete. Remember that if you're going to write these, if I'm writing some JavaScript, and I eventually want to take that JavaScript, and I want to have the JavaScript in its own file, and I want to include that as a script tag in an HTML file, and I want some CSS that I'm going to have in its own file, and I'm going to also eventually try to include that. Then what I would be doing if I were you is when I start this stuff, if I'm writing just JavaScript, I'd go into JS-bin and I'd be trying to test the stuff in there and see whether or not it works. Remember, you can come into here and you can just open up JavaScript, key in anything you want there. So you can put a whole JavaScript program there. Now, if it's main, etc., then on the bottom, you're going to have to literally call main. But what that'll do is down at the bottom here is it'll show you any errors or warnings you have. All right? Some people like to do that. Some people like to use what's called the JavaScript runner. All right? And you put it into here and you do the same thing. But what I tried doing yesterday, when I tried bringing up your your assignments, for instance, if I brought up the HTML file and nothing happened, and it happened more than once, then what I did was I grabbed your code and tried to put it into JS-bin, or I tried to put it into JavaScript runner. And almost 100% of the time, when I put it in one or the other and I tried to run it, it came up with an error. You have to fix those errors and then resubmit it. Does all that make sense? So if you look at the homework and you go, I don't know what I did wrong, etc., or it runs on mine, then just, because I'm done talking, then just have me come over and take a look at it on yours. That's fine. So starting Wednesday in class, we're going to start writing a website as a class. All right? Between what I'm going to try to do, though, is there are enough people in the class that are behind. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to lecture Wednesday. But then the next couple weeks, well, actually it's just next week. Next week I'm going to lecture on Monday. Wednesday is going to be a lab day. All right? So if you're all caught up and you don't show Wednesday, then you don't show Wednesday. All right? 2 weeks from now, we meet Monday. There are no classes on that Wednesday because that's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so there are no classes. So it'll be lecture Wednesday when we start the website, lecture next Monday, lab next Wednesday, then lecture the following Monday. Then we'll see what it's like when we get back from the break. After the break, there's 6 more classes. The week of the 30th, the week of the 7th, the week of the 14th, and you're done. All right? Questions?
For Wednesday, are you going to give us handouts to do for it? Or?
The question is, on Wednesday, am I going to give you handouts? Ideally, we're going to, at least to start, we're going to be working on it as a class. But whatever I create as at least a shell, I'll put it out there eventually, or I'll give you a handout, one or the other. Okay. We'll come up with something.